Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk mostly about abstraction and hierarchy. I actually had the slides and everything ready. I posted them last week itself. I mentioned to you that we were talking about abstraction in terms of course, disjunction, etc. So before I get started, are there any questions? Okay. So anyway, so today is Eid for those who celebrate Islam. It's like the biggest festival. Couple of students in the class actually sent me a message saying, "Can I please miss the class today?" And so I didn't want to get into the trouble of saying, "No, you can't miss the class even on Eid." It's like the biggest festival as far as I know for Islam. Anyway, this was actually. I was in Delhi last month, as you know, and Delhi is full of mosques, and this is one of the 1561. It was built. It's not even one of the well-known ones. It's basically built by a courtier of Akbar, and it was still actually in use, but it's not really doing that well. So I saw all these kids having like a nice little party outside. That particular time in Delhi was one of the few times the weather was very nice. So they told me that if I ever come back to Delhi, I should go at that time. So now I think it's too hot. Anyway, we're going to talk about abstraction and hierarchy. There is like a huge number of connected techniques that are all over the place in both planning, automated planning, and reinforcement learning, and lots of these things. And like basically, if one way of getting respectability to anything you're doing is to say this is about abstraction or this is about hierarchy, and it's like always a good thing to say. Nobody would be against abstraction and hierarchy are sort of like the motherhood and apple pie of AI, right? In the sense that how could you be against abstraction? How could you be against hierarchical reasoning? The tricky thing, of course, as we'll find out, is there are two big issues. There's like a large number of ideas that are like, are all basically fall under the umbrella of abstraction and hierarchy. And I basically look at several of them from planning and, to some extent, reinforcement learning perspective. But the tricky things that you want to keep in mind is there are like two kinds of challenges that come when you have abstractions. One is where are you getting the abstractions? Where are you getting the abstractions? And the other is how does inference is basically like planning, whatever you want to do, is change when you have abstractions, when you have abstraction hierarchy. And how does it change when you have abstractions and hierarchy? And to be completely honest, there's like, at least in the beginnings of AI, like basically most of the work in automated planning as well as AI in general has assumed that abstractions would be given by knowledge engineer. The same guy who gave the PDDL to you also gives the abstractions, also gives the hierarchy. You see what I'm saying? I mean, so if you're anyway asking them, give me the model, then you might as well ask them, they might also say, well, instead of thinking about it as like a flat model, here is a hierarchical model. These are more abstract, this is less abstract. Okay, so much of the expectation in planning, automated planning, has been assuming that they've been given. Okay, just like you didn't ask exactly where did you get the PDDL. I mean, you write, I mean, if it's an important domain, you will write a model. So, you could actually be doing, the models which are, basically, you will have, some of you may have already realized that there may be something called HPDDDL, which will allow you to specify hierarchical versions of PDDL. In fact, it turns out normal PDDL already has support for abstract actions. We don't talk too much about it because we didn't really talk about how to use them. But, and there are some groups which actually, have variations of PDDL modeling language where you can provide the abstraction, you can provide that hierarchy. Okay? So that's one idea. And then, of course, increasingly we are interested in learning them. Right now, like it's increasingly being most of the work right now is sort of about learning part rather than inference part. Except one of the things is then, we will basically get to that a little later in some sense, but basically more of the discussion. So the front and center would be how do things change if in fact you have abstract models. The models with abstraction hierarchy. How does planning change? Okay? And that we will figure out much of today. And then we'll start slowly, in the background we'll be talking about how could these have been learned. So one thing that you possibly, just a kind of a way of connecting things is to say that, remember the only time in this class we talked about learning PDL models was when? In this class, when was the only time we talked at all, even in passing, about learning as against people just giving the PDL?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that people were using like LLMs to generate PDL.
Yeah, so basically you could use LLMs to quote unquote extract PDDL, right? And you can extend those techniques to some extent to, in fact, one can argue that the other very, very, very big thing about abstraction, so abstraction is this, this side is more abstract and this side is less abstract. So maybe concrete. So some actions are abstract, some actions are concrete. Some conditions are abstract conditions, some conditions are more concrete, conditions, closer to the. Yeah. And so the hierarchy is basically, this is the hierarchy. So it's like a hierarchy of more abstract to less abstract to finally very concrete actions, right? One very big thing you want to remember, like in the background, is one woman's abstraction is another woman's concrete action. Right? You can situate yourself in any place in this, depending on the agent. So if you have a very effective assistant, you can give them abstract actions to do, and they just do it for you. You don't have to tell them exactly how to do that abstract action by actually going to the more concrete levels. Do you understand what I'm saying? So interestingly, the whole notion of abstraction, of course, is sort of a relative thing. So ultimately, you have in your mind, let's say, there is an executor that is executing things in the world. It can take instructions as to the kinds of actions it gets to execute. And the question is, if it can take very abstract actions, and normally, remember, abstraction also means disjunction. So when you tell somebody, go to San Francisco tomorrow, right? That's an abstract action for them. So you could keep complaining, you can tell them exactly, okay, which particular flight do you want me to go by? What Uber should I take? What dress should I wear? All these questions you can ask, and the more and more of these details you give, they don't have to essentially resolve any disjunction. If you say just go to San Francisco, that's like telling, if I ask you, go to San Francisco tomorrow, I'm basically telling you, you can pick any one of the many different ways to go to San Francisco. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, in general, when you are giving an abstract instruction to an agent, let's say an acting agent, then it's leaving open like how exactly to implement that abstract action. Do you see what I'm saying? And if your agent is actually kind of a dumber agent which cannot do any disjunction, then you have to give them more. So they may very well come and say, I don't have an action called go to San Francisco. I only have an action called, go from, this pixel location to this location, geolocation to this geolocation by this particular conveyance. And you tell me what, go to San Francisco means in my terms. Did you understand what I'm saying? And so the interesting question is, the more you have an executor that can take abstract instructions, the more you get to kind of give them abstract instructions, and they will then have to resolve the disjunction. They have to resolve the disjunction in trying to figure out which particular version of the, like for example, go to San Francisco tomorrow. Like, is it reasonable for me to go to San Francisco such that I reach at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow? Why did you think that's not reasonable? I didn't tell you anything. I just said go to San Francisco. And in fact, maybe I said go to San Francisco tomorrow. And you're sort of using all sorts of additional common sense knowledge that when people say go to San Francisco, they say kind of be there like during the daytime or something. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, and it's also possible that if in fact go to San Francisco, you can go by car, you can go by train, you can go by bus, you can go by flight, and you are trying to figure out which particular way to implement the go to San Francisco action, you the agent, you the executing agent. The more you can take abstract actions, the easier it is for somebody giving you instructions. Right? I mean, imagine there's an advisor student or there's a boss and a secretary. Like, the more you have to give all the concrete actions, you might say, why do I need a student? I'll just do it myself. Or why do I need a secretary? I'll do it myself. Because I have to give too many details. Okay, so that's something that you want to keep in mind. And abstraction has disjunction. And one interesting question about this disjunction, which we'll, as we are going on, we'll keep coming back. Did I mention angelic uncertainty in the class? Okay, in general, if you have disjunction, right, that's a bad thing. In general, if you have disjunction, that's a bad thing. Because, so for example, you have an action, toss a coin. It is either heads or tails, right? And that's a disjunctive effect. That is basically a disjunction that you can't control. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's a disjunction that you can't control. Whereas, if on the other hand you say, go to SFO, it can be done by train 1, train 2, light 1, light 2, all these things. And there is a disjunction, there are many, many possibilities. But you get to resolve the disjunction. The agent gets to resolve the disjunction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is why, even though disjunction exists when there is stochastic effects, and disjunction also exists with abstraction, the disjunction with abstraction is considered like a good disjunction. Because you have control, you are just doing least commitment. The disjunction there is called least commitment. We talked a lot about it last time. So you are basically keeping all the options and then kind of committing as and when needed. So this is basically called angelic uncertainty. It's an uncertainty that you are pushing on yourself. Do you understand what I'm saying? To make life simple, you're saying, I know that ultimately I have to decide exactly which, exact time I will have to wake up tomorrow, which specific Uber I have to take, which specific ticket counter I have to stand in to get my boarding pass or whatever, and then finally which flight to get in. That's the actual executed plan. When you are executing the plan, you only execute a single plan. You don't execute, I'm in one of these two planes kind of a execution. Right? And yet, by thinking, you think as if, okay, tomorrow I will be going to San Francisco. And that basically corresponds to all different ways of going to San Francisco. So you are actually pushing disjunction onto yourself just to kind of reduce the search space to some extent upfront. And the hope, general hope with abstraction is if there is a problem in the abstract plan, then you can sort of kill that plan right there itself. Do you understand what I'm saying? So imagine tomorrow you have to go to San Francisco. Tomorrow I'll also put like a pop quiz. I'll call you all to class and say there will be a pop quiz tomorrow. Right? So you could basically, you have to make a plan for both of these things, presumably. So now you could try to say, I will try to go to San Francisco by Southwest, starting at 6:03 a.m., blah, blah, blah. And then try to get to do the second goal. I have to be in the class at whatever, 9 o'clock or something to take the pop quiz. Then you realize, looks like it doesn't work. Then you go back, let me try instead of 6:03, let me take the 7 a.m. flight on instead of Southwest on American. Let's see if I can do this. You will fail again. You see one failure is being rediscovered a zillion times. What you really need to do is, look, if I'm going to San Francisco, it'll have one effect that I won't be in Tempe. Right? And if I need to be taking the exam tomorrow, I need to be in Tempe. Being not in Tempe and being in Tempe are mutually exclusive. So irrespective of the fact that I still haven't figured out exactly what dress I'm going to wear for my exam and what particular flight I am taking for San Francisco, you already know that it's not going to work. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the idea about abstraction sometimes is to actually find failures upfront, earlier. This is very important to keep in mind because after what looks like an eternity, we will get to hierarchical task networks where we will talk about, for example, if you have an HTN plan which has unresolvable interactions at a certain level, at the current level, can you kill that plan? The whole point of abstraction is to be able to kill that plan. But I'll turn around and I'll tell you, depending on the way the abstract tasks are actually specified to be reduced to concrete subtasks, what looks like an unresolvable interaction might actually be resolvable at a lower levels. That looks like things have gone basically the whole point of abstraction seems to have been lost because you can't kill the plan, even though it is dying, because as you come down, things might actually, the interaction might be resolvable. And then, to blow your mind further, we'll point out that the only time that won't happen is if, in fact, the task network schemas are given in such a way that, in general, the idea for HTN schema, typically, we'll get to the details again in a minute, but you have A1, which is then split, basically made into some partial plan. So the A1 becomes a new partial plan. Just like, go to San Francisco becomes an actual plan, right? So the A1 can be, basically reduced into multiple partial plans. And imagine you have a partial plan where essentially there currently are interactions that are, and so one of the issues that we'll find out is if in fact in like things like plan space planning, this guy A1 is taking things, conditions, and giving conditions out. The question is, when A1 goes away, who gets these conditions here, and who gives these effects from here? You see what I'm saying? This is sort of like your dad or mom having debts and assets. The question is, which of the juniors take on the debts and which of the juniors get the assets? You see what I'm saying? The best world would be like the eldest guy takes all the debts and the youngest girl gets all the assets, right? But of course, that's one way. But obviously, we have a very different way, which is generally there is things like primogeniture, where all the debts and the assets go to one person in the family. In many cultures, it's not required, but that's how you kind of make the culture. So similarly, one of the things you can do, we'll see, is we might say that, so it might look like you can have somebody take the condition, some other guy give the effects. If you do that, which is like a flexible thing to do, if you do that, then if there is a plan that A1 is taking part in where it looks like there is an interaction that cannot be resolved, it can magically get resolved lower level because A1 is a single thing, but it's really becoming multiple things lower down, and so there is actually, quote unquote, temporal gap between the different things. If on the other hand, just a second, if on the other hand, you use basically some variation of primogeniture called unique subaction restriction. It's a syntactic restriction, where basically you're saying all the preconditions and effects of the main guy get inherited by a single action in the reduction. There can be other actions that are I'm coming for the fun, but all the main work is being done by this one single action. That will be the unique main subaction. If you do that, then it turns out that if there is a failure at the top level, you can kill that plan because it will still not be resolvable lower down. And this actually weirdly binds up being connected to temporal gap, which we talked about previous class in terms of temporal planning. You see what I'm saying? So that's sort of a high-level overview of where we are going. This stuff may well come like 2 hours later or maybe even next class, depending on the speed at which I am going. But the basic thing that you want to keep in mind as we are going through things is, what is the kind of abstraction? Of course, what is the kind of abstraction? And then where are you getting them? How do you change the planning algorithm to use them? Yes?
I don't know if this is like the same type of thing, but when you were talking about lighting a candle and walking across a room like in the dark, and how like you couldn't necessarily like order the two things like so one.
That was the whole point of temporal gap. That was the connection I'm making.
That's basically the same.
It's connected.
Okay.
Even though these are two different worlds, it turns out that the same notion of temporal gap seems to make a difference here too.
Okay.
For a really weird reason. But this is, notice how crazy syntactic thing this is. A1 was supposed to take some debts, some preconditions, and is giving some effects. I don't know which is, in planning terminology, is this the debts and is this assets? I don't know. If you're getting preconditions, maybe those are assets. And if you're giving out, that's like debts, right? Looks like, right? And I would say, then it has assets and debts. And if you give assets to some people and debts to some other people in the reduction, the people being the subactions in the restrictions in the schema, the reduction schema, then that's a more flexible thing to do. But that also means that certain useful properties of abstractions will be lost. The equally interesting thing is essentially, a related thing, of course, is, so what I said here is if the abstract plan dies, can you kill it? Can you kill the entire branch? The other idea is if the abstract plan exists, will there be a concrete plan? You see what I'm saying? So at the level at which I am thinking, it looks like the abstract plan is actually valid. And then so I give it to my agent to say, "Ah, these are the things you have to do." And the agent basically tries to figure out different ways of reducing these abstract actions and take care of interactions, and finds there is no way of taking care of interactions. Then it so happens that it comes back and says, "Hey, I can't do this abstract plan." You see what I'm saying? This is actually what happens between bosses and employees, or advisors and students, because advisors are at an abstract level and say, "Yeah, do the following things as well as have some fun, plus write these 3 papers and come back and see me tomorrow morning." At a certain level of abstraction, it looks all doable. And then you are saying, "Oh, how am I supposed to find time for this, and all this stuff?" That's your problem, I say. Right? So the question is, if there is an abstract plan, will there be a concrete plan that is actually going to be valid? You understand what I'm saying? That's important too. Otherwise, you are in this la-la land where, "Oh, I have an abstract plan, I'm done with this problem." And then somebody who's actually trying to execute it, or a search algorithm that tries to actually make a concrete version out of it, will fail. So after you leave, it's coming back to basically backtrack out of this abstract plan. You guys understand what I'm saying? This idea is called downward refinement property. In general, most abstractions don't have this property. It's worth having it, but it's not necessary that you will have it. Right? Most of the times what happens with the abstractions is, abstractions work most of the time, except sometimes they won't. That's the price you pay for not thinking at the concrete level. Do you see what I'm saying? So given the distribution of the problems, this is a good abstraction because in many of the problems, this abstraction saves you time. But there may be a small number of cases where actually it doesn't save you time, so you will come down and you have to backtrack up. Downward refinement property, basically you can think of it in terms of like a categorical property, and if it exists, that means it always, if there is an abstract plan, there will always be a concrete plan. Okay, if on the other hand it's a highly probabilistic property, that means most of the time it will hold and sometimes it won't hold. And so the reason you are still using the abstractions is because there's a high probability that what works in abstract also works in concrete. By the way, all these things like it works in theory, doesn't work in practice, that's again abstraction idea. In theory it should work, but actually in practice it doesn't work because there are certain things that you are ignoring, certain interactions you are ignoring. Right? Now, if you have that, then the other question is, then basically in terms of in theory it works, will it work in practice, is downward refinement property. In practice it works, does it work in theory? That's LLMs, honestly. Because we have no theory of LLMs. But more importantly, if there is a solution for the problem, is there a solution at the abstract space for that problem? This is a very interesting, different question. That means this problem can be solved, but at the abstract level, you will find there is no solution. You will try to search the entire space. There is not a single abstract plan that is interactionless. So you say it cannot be solved. In theory, it can't be solved, and you go home, and then people actually solve it in practice. You see what I'm saying? That is basically because, again, that particular hierarchy doesn't have what is called upward solution property. You see what I'm saying? So it's like you have made an abstraction, and if you solve it only at that abstract level, and if it is solvable there, the question is it solvable in the concrete level? That's a downward refinement property. which if it doesn't exist, you lose efficiency because you're wasting time trying to solve it in abstract place only to come down and find there is no solution, and you'll backtrack and you have to find another abstract plan. Right? If on the other hand, you have no solution in the abstract plane, can you just say, in theory it's not solvable, so it is not solvable? In abstraction, it's not solvable, so it's not solvable. I mean, by the way, theory and practice, I'm using theory to be abstract and practice to be concrete. Okay? But really, if it cannot be solved in abstract plane, then you better be sure that it can't also be solved in concrete plane. Right? Otherwise, then abstraction basically is making you miss some problems. Right? And interestingly, that if you don't have the upward solution property, then you lose completeness. So that means if you are insisting on doing things in abstract with abstract actions, the only reasonable thing is to, if there's no plan in the abstract level, you should just give up. Right? But if it turns out that there is a solution actually to the problem, and that solution doesn't correspond to an abstract plan, that means you would never have found a footprint, or whatever, the reverse footprint of the solution into the abstract space. Do you see what I'm saying? And so you would essentially assume this problem can't be solved, but actually it was solved. This is called upward solution property. Both are very important. These are the properties you need to think about when you think about abstraction. And one of the things I hope you'll get again out of this class is the words abstraction and hierarchy are overused all over AI. And most of these kinds of properties are important everywhere. Everybody is always pushing stuff under the rug. And one of the hopes is figuring out what people are pushing under the rug so that you understand in what sense is it a good abstraction. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So to give an idea, right? For example, one of the things that we will get to, again, just sort of since I'm talking at this level, imagine I have concrete level actions. Okay, that include taking, walking, going into an airport, getting into the plane, also hitchhiking, also running, also walking. Okay, and then there are concrete, hierarchical actions, the abstract actions, and that have things like take a flight, take a train, drive a car to go from place to place. You see what I'm saying? Right? So if in fact in that scenario you actually are trying to find if there is a plane, if there is a way to go from Phoenix to San Francisco. Turns out that there are no flights. Let's say no flights and no trains. There's obviously no trains, and also no cars, let's say, for some reason. Okay? Then you would basically say that there's no plan to go from Phoenix to San Francisco. But you could have walked. Nobody stops you. The concrete action will actually talk about walking. In fact, my better version of the one concrete plan that will get you from Phoenix to San Francisco is walk half a mile, hitchhike for 2 miles, then run for half a mile again, then basically again hitchhike, blah, 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 until you reach, San Francisco. That is a strips valid plan, right? Because plans are ultimately executed in the concrete level, and it's a strips valid plan. And yet, you could not actually have found any upper footprint or the reverse footprint of this in the abstract level. So most abstractions actually don't have upward solution property.
You're saying that in most situations there may not be a way to kind of map back up to a abstract.
Yes, there could be plans that actually don't correspond to abstract plans.
Can you give an example?
This is the one. So imagine you have an abstraction of a travel domain. Any abstraction of the travel domain, for example, involves taking planes, taking trains, and taking cars. That's it. It doesn't talk about walking oftentimes, and it certainly doesn't talk about walk for a little bit, then bike for a little bit, then hitchhike for a little bit, then walk for a little bit, then bike for a little bit, then hitchhike for a little bit, until you reach San Francisco. That is a valid plan, but you never make them. That's why when you look at the way most people do planning, by the way, this is where actually the notion of how abstractions are learned comes into play. How did you learn abstractions? The way you learn it one way is you saw people actually going to San Francisco and various places, and you found they seem to be using one of 3 or 4 different types. They go by flight, or they go by car, or they go by train. That's it. So you basically say it's a reasonable thing to think of abstract level actions to be these. But that's what they do most of the time. But if in fact remember, any of you were alive in 2001? Okay, so September 2001, basically people weird ways of traveling from Phoenix to San Francisco, September 11, 2001, because US airspace was closed. I mean, it doesn't happen in US, we make sure that it happens in other countries all the time. But in US, airspace is never closed. Not, right? And so we suddenly had to give up on our abstract actions. People found weirdo ways of going from place to place. Those are not the normal ones for which you get a travel plan in Travelocity or Expedia, etc. You still went to places that you got to go, needed to go. Do you understand what I'm saying? The reason you made these kinds of abstractions is because most of the plans wind up using these standard ways of doing things. Now, that brings up a question. What is the point of abstraction? So, in particular, the fact that the normal travel plan domain would not allow for part hitchhike, part bicycle, part walk as a normal plan for the going to San Francisco goal. Should this be a problem with the abstraction or not?
I didn't get the question.
The question is basically, so I basically said that normal travel plans abstraction, and we'll get into more technical details in a bit, but the normal travel plans would never eventually become walk a little bit, go, bike a little bit, then hitchhike a little bit until you reach your final destination, stop. Right? Do you see what I'm saying? Those kinds of plans don't correspond. Those kind of plans possibly can't correspond to anything in the abstract level. Any good abstractions. Because good abstractions would have looked at very standard ways of travel. Now, having decided this, you get to either say that with these abstractions, I have lost completeness. Because the problem can be solved, in upward solution property is lost, means completeness is lost. Right? That means there is actually a way of solving the problem, even though it doesn't look solvable at the abstract. Or you can change and say, I never wanted those kinds of plans anyway. Those are only bozos do those kinds of plans. And then the question is, what exactly do you mean by bozos doing those kinds of plans? So you might wind up having a circular definition, saying the plans that I care about are all the plans that can come from the abstraction. You see what I'm saying? As long as I can find them, I'm complete, otherwise it's okay. Otherwise I don't care about those other plans. The problem with that is, what if you wrote a bad algorithm that just made additional errors in how to use the existing abstractions? So there should be a more declarative way of looking at the abstraction, looking at a plan and say, is this plan possible given the abstraction? There is actually a way of thinking about that, and we'll talk about it. We can basically, something like these HTN task reduction schemas, you can either think of them as abstract actions becoming more concrete actions, or you can think of these equivalently as a grammar of preferred solutions. So this is the non-terminal, and this is maybe some non-terminals, some terminals, some non-terminals. Do you guys know what I'm talking about from your theory courses, terminal, non-terminal? So I have basically, now I'm saying, you can think of the schemas, this kind of abstractions, reductions to be a sort of a grammar rules. And why do we use grammar in language? You can actually give an ungrammatical sentence that conveys the meaning, especially for any of you who have learned more than one language, that basically means non-Americans. Basically, you would know that the second language is much harder when you are trying to learn it. First language, you were making mistakes and you were looking cute, so nobody cared that you were making stupid mistakes, right? But second language time, you are about 20 years old or maybe 15 years old, and you're still making grammatical mistakes, and people of that language think that this guy needs some kind of brain surgery, can't follow that. It's not that grammar is crazy nonsense, right? And so basically, and then there's like rules with exceptions to exceptions to exceptions to exceptions, right? They exist, right? So the interesting question is, what is grammar? You can give a sentence in English that may actually give semantics of what it is that you're trying to tell the person, right? And then and I'm thinking of this funny joke in a minute, but I'll get to that. But so you can actually you can also talk about, is it grammatical, and how do you say something is grammatical in the old ways, not the current way. The current way basically you just say let LLM make it and it will be grammatical anyway. Right? Yeah. In the old way, the idea is, can you parse it using the grammar rules? You see what I'm saying? You have these terminals. The sentence is a bunch of terminal words. You basically parse it using grammar rules such that it has been fully parsed. So there is a way of using the rules of grammar to produce this sentence syntactically. You can have grammatically correct sentences which have no meaning, which you can have meaningful sentences which don't have grammar. Right? I mean, how many of you have heard of colorful green arrows sleeping furiously? Colorless green arrows sleeping furiously. This is an amazing, it's an example due to Noam Chomsky. And basically, colorless green arrows sleeping furiously. Yeah, that basically looks like grammatically correct sentence. It just has no meaning. On the other hand, after the break, I'll show you this. They were basically saying there's this English teacher goes into the bathroom, and on the mirror is saying it's going to be kill time tomorrow or something, and then she realizes that it doesn't have the apostrophe. She puts that first, and then she puts a comma next place, and then puts a full stop next. She got the meaning in the beginning, but until it's grammatical, she can't actually be afraid. Just to make fun of English teachers. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you think of these things as grammar, it blows your mind. What the whole reason to get to this is somehow to reduce the, kind of the search involved in coming up with the plans, etc., which is what I've been pushing before. But now I suddenly changed my mind and I said, if you want to allow for cases where abstraction may not actually cover all the plans in the bottom level, and you still want to say it is complete, then you will say that a plan is valid with respect to a hierarchical task network schema, if it in fact there is a way of finding a parse for it. If it parsed, then it's grammatically correct. That means it is and the grammatically correct means preferred to some extent. So this actually tells you that of all the valid ways of going from Phoenix to San Francisco, some are preferred. And the preferred ones I'm telling you using my abstraction. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is again true for many, many types of abstractions. When you do abstraction, you lose completeness. It looks like it can't, in that abstract case, it looks like there is no solution. So you give up. And then if basically that, if you want to kind of have, if you want to then, so that one thing that I don't want you to do, that you can still do is, of course, you can say I have these actions with their reductions, and I have the concrete actions. So I have a normal planner as well as a hierarchical planner, both together. And if any of them solves the problem, I'll give the solution. And believe it or not, you can write papers on this, saying that HTM planning, is actually incomplete. So what we do is we will essentially remove the abstraction so that it becomes complete. But then don't you realize that you gave up on the abstraction now? Do you see what I'm saying? Right? And the question is that people don't ask that, and so there's this notion of whenever you have, I'm talking about from the point of view of deterministic plans, but this is completely holds for MDPs and hierarchical reinforcement learning, everything. Okay, so in general, this notion of completeness is redefined in terms of hierarchical completeness. That means if in fact it can be reached through the hierarchy and you still didn't find it, then you can be yielded. If it can't be reached by the hierarchy and you didn't find it, then you're okay. So somebody who doesn't have the hierarchy actually can solve the problem. You see what I'm saying? So this basically way of looking at things is essentially understanding that abstraction and hierarchy very quickly become intertwined with other ideas like, of course, disjunction, which I already told you, and yet another idea called preferences. One of the things we basically acted in strips planning is if a plan is correct, if in fact you can execute the first action, you get the next state, then you get to execute the next action, you get the next state, etc., all the way to the end. Right? But then turns out that not every such plan is a reasonable plan that people would be happy with, even though it is doable. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like going to San Francisco by hitchhiking and walking and running. It's doable. But people will basically look askance at you saying, what sort of a crazy plan are you doing? Do you see what I'm saying? So that basically means in the universe of valid plans, there are some that are kind of preferred and some that are not so preferred. And right now I'm taking up in terms of grammaticality, like say, if it is grammatically possible, then it's preferred, otherwise it's not preferred. But you can generalize this and say degrees of preferences of the many different plans, which is the one that you really like. And you might say, why can't you put this as an optimization metric of some kind? The problem typically is that these kinds of things are not easily expressible. First of all, people don't quite realize what exactly are their preferences. And secondly, they may not be easily expressible in the optimization. So it's much simpler to just do it in this hierarchical plan. There was a question.
Preferences are like preconditions, or are they just common sense for people?
No, preferences are basically which plans do you like versus which plans do you like. Because one of the things up until now, you have been generally happy with any plan that is strips correct. That means you can do the first action, then the next action, and final action, you'll be in the goal state. Right? But then there are many weirdo things that can happen. Like for example, here is the situation, right? So okay, and I want my goal is on AC. Right? So I can here is a plan. Pick up A, put down A, pick up C, stack C on B, unstack and then stack, pick up A, stack A on C, unstack A from C, put down A, pick up unstack C from B, C from B, put down B, and then stack A onto C. If I give you this plan, you check using progression, it will be correct. You can use regression, it will be correct. You check using plan space planning, it will be correct. But you will be laughed out of the room. It's like badly inoptimal. But you might think, oh, here I can capture it very easily in terms of just the number of actions. But number of actions is just one measure. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make sense. What you're really seeing is, in this particular case, there is a preference for sort of minimal number of moves plans, and certain types of things don't correspond to minimal number of moves. Do you understand what I'm saying? So, in general, preferences are connected to optimization. But preferences normally can be done in terms of just optimization metric. But you can also give them more generally in terms of the abstraction hierarchies. And the last thing, before I go through this very big digression before actually going back to the first slide, is LLMs actually help. LLMs don't know how to give non-preferred plans. By and large. Weird. LLMs will never give that kind of plan. They might, so just as, that's actually equivalent to saying LLMs hallucinate but are always grammatical. I think I might have mentioned it to you that the first thing that surprised me with LLMs was that you could not make them give an output that is ungrammatical, at least in English, for sure, right? And since English was a second language for me, maybe a third language, actually maybe a second language, I think. So I always had major trouble actually making, and now it's become part of the compiling thing, but for a long time I would generate and test whether it's grammatical or not. And so LLM seems to be just generating only grammatical sentences. That's like half of the problem for people learning the language as a second language. And so if it is grammatical, that style, you think it must be correct too, which is content. Hallucination is about content, not about style. They will give grammatically correct sentences that may not actually be correct, right in the word that you're looking at. Similarly, LLMs can give plans that don't execute, but they look like the plans that people will be happy with. They will never say, do like half walk, half run, half blah blah blah, and reach sometimes. So most likely to give you the more likely completion would be take the flight. Maybe next is take the train. Because they've been trained on the human data. And there aren't too many humans hitchhiking right now. You see what I'm saying? So that's the bigger lay of the land. And now I'm going to walk you through the slides. There's a question? Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I've understood this correctly. So for the abstract plan, you have grammar that checks whether the concrete plan is correct or
no. What I'm actually saying is, again, we will get to this again second time. My hope is I'm saying it. So I'm saying it first so that you know what to expect, and then I will say it again, and then you can make the connection back. All I'm saying in general is everybody thinks, for example, when we get to hierarchical task network planning, that it's all about abstraction. If it is about abstraction, then the grammar interpretation is very different from the abstraction interpretation. Right? And it turns out that actually most uses of hierarchical task networks are better understood in terms of grammar idea than the abstraction idea. Because actually they don't have this unique means of action kind of restrictions, and so Just because there's a failure in the top level, you can't kill it necessarily, for example. And also they don't have upward solution property. There can be plans that for this problem that the HTM planner won't find. And the only way to make sense of it is that it's finding all the plans that it can, which looks circular. So you make it non-circular by saying only the plans that are parsable by the HTM schemas from the bottom up are the ones that it's supposed to find. And if your planner doesn't find it, then it's a wrong, the algorithm must be done. Okay? And so the interesting question then, of course, is if you believe in abstraction, normally you would do the planning by doing. I think most of you thought this way. You know, you would do the planning by coming up with an abstract plan, making it more concrete, until you say, okay, now the secretary or the student can do it, and you go home. That's how you would do the use of abstraction. If on the other hand you are interested in grammar, you would be silly to do it that way. You don't start by, if you are trying to tell something to somebody, you don't first start saying, okay, let me make sure of some grammatical sentence and see if it is the one that I wanted to say. You see what I'm saying? You are generating token by token by token the words that you are spelling out, and then in some sense, in the background, you are saying, am I going into ungrammatical parts? How many of you, this stuff actually is very easy to understand right now, because if you start typing in Google Docs or Gmail, at some point of time it starts putting red things, even though you haven't written the entire sentence. You say, how do you know that I can make it grammatical? Well, it says, no, with this partial part you cannot make it grammatical. That's what it's saying. You understand what I'm saying? So what it's actually doing is, as you are typing the sentence, it is keeping track of partial parses for this sentence. In effect, it's not actually doing that way, but if you write an algorithm, that's what you wind up doing. For any sentence that you are writing, you keep the tree of partial parses right now. If then the tree of partial parses becomes empty, that means this sentence is dead now. It's floating in the water. You have basically, it's a partial sentence. It's already grammatically so muddled up that you can't actually make it grammatical anymore. You understand what I'm saying? You could do hierarchical task network planning that way, which is actually much simpler in one level, which is you let strips planner or your plan space planner or your regression planner generate plans at the lowest level. But you have this extra module that is looking at the plan that is coming up, either it's a plan space plan or let's say a prefix plan, whatever, and checking is there still any hope that it will be parsable based on the rules I have. If it is not parsable, that means there is not even a single parse left, you say you're dead. I mean, basically it tells the guy, get out of this branch and go to a different branch. This is called bottom-up hierarchical task network planning. Crazy. How can you do bottom-up and hierarchical? If you have hierarchical, you normally want to do top-down. Do you understand what I'm saying? In entire life, when you thought there's a hierarchy, you'll do top-down, not bottom-up.
Is there an advantage?
What?
Is there an advantage from between like the bottom up and the
Actually, it turns out it's just as good. In fact, it actually has fewer headaches for the bottom up. Don't really. I'm 40 years in this area. So yes, there's a paper by Dan Weld and Tony Barrett that you can read that I'll tell you later about. But yes, it turns out, again, writing such a program is really hairy, but that program works faster. Whereas writing the top-down hierarchical planners sounds more intuitive, but it's full of crazy issues such as unique main sub-action, and I also tell you things about phantom goals, which is a weirdo thing. Phantom goals basically is, there's a plan, currently you need a G, and currently there's an abstract plan, and the abstract plan has an action which has only abstract effects, not all the effects are given. According to that, G cannot be supported. So in general, it turns out, we'll get to it, but hierarchical task network planning is easiest seen as plan space planning plus some more. That's it. Okay, instead of plan space planning where you put normal steps, you put also abstract steps. So you remember that in plan space planning there is simple establishment, which is if in fact the goal can be supported by an action that is currently present in the plan, you should consider that as one of the options, and other things, and adding steps are the other options. But when you have an abstract action, even if it is not actually giving the condition, maybe one of its descendants will give the condition. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you by mistake decided to support goal right now, if you basically are possibly ignoring one possible way in which it will become magically supported because of the descendants of this abstract step. Right? And so what you'll wind up doing is you do something called phantom establishment. Phantom establishment is waiting for Godot. So just to get completeness, you say for everything, if basically in addition to the obvious ones that are saying we'll give you this condition, we'll put one more phantom task whose only thing is I will give you this goal. And if there is somebody else lower down who actually winds up being that thing, then the phantom task becomes that. This is just bookkeeping way to not lose completeness, which is yet another way of understanding that doing top-down hierarchical task network planning is very, very full of holes. Whereas doing it bottom-up is just grammar. You no longer have these notions of abstraction, completeness, etc. And unfortunately, both of these types of intuitions are required to understand what's going on in abstractions, in planning as well as outside of planning. Pretty much anywhere you see abstractions, both of these are. Okay? Okay. Given that I did so much about this, maybe what I should do is I will come back to this part later, and let me just do the hierarchical task network planning first. Just because I said so much of it already. Yeah. Yeah. So this is actually the second half. Is it coming here? Yeah, good. Just 1 second. Yeah. No, I want to. Give me a second. Where is the setup slideshow? Okay, setup slideshow. Browse by individual. That's good. Okay. Okay. All right. So, I'm sorry I did all of that without these pictures, but now you can see these pictures and feel better. Okay. I'm actually a big believer in, I think, this Schopenhauer's statement that life only makes sense when viewed backwards, but unfortunately it has to be lived forwards. Right? And to some extent in teaching, I try to kind of go forward a bit so that you'll have the context, and then come back again and take you, basically give you a bigger picture before going slide by slide, because I can do slide by slide. I know how to do it. You can read it, I can read it. But it's better to know, oh, that's what he was saying second time. So that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so HTN planning is actually, we will talk about lots and lots of simpler ideas than this, but in some sense, in these discussions, HTN planning is like the most complex idea that brings together a whole bunch of notions of abstraction and hierarchy together. We'll talk about the simpler ones later. I was going to do that first, but since we talked so much about HTN planning, you might as well do it now. Okay, so what you're doing is like, you will have actions like, they tend to call them tasks, but travel from source to destination. That's an abstract task. That might actually be, you may be able to split it into like go by bus, source to destination, go by train, source to destination. And the go by bus, source to destination might say get into the bus, buy the ticket, get out at the destination. And then here, buy the ticket, get into the bus, get into the train, and get out. So I made it slightly interesting that in many trains, I understand there are exceptions, in many trains you better have the ticket before you get in. In several buses, you actually get the ticket inside the bus. So that's one difference, for example. So this is, in addition to basically the primitive actions, I'm actually telling you canned procedures for doing things. But these canned procedures are actually abstract because there are different levels of abstraction. Travel can be decided, you could do it by go by bus or go by train. And then if you're going by bus, then this is a way of going by bus. And interestingly, here it turned out that this one has disjunction. Traveling, it can involve either going by bus or going by train. But for going by bus, there is no disjunction. There's only one way of doing it. Who wrote this? As I said, you have given this, just like the PDL specification, you have been given this. Okay? That's what HTN planning is. Okay? So so domain model essentially constraints. So domain model, in addition to primitive actions, which are the normal strips actions, also contains these non-primitive actions. Go by bus, go by train, etc. And so for every action in the domain, there is a flag saying primitive, non-primitive. Just like terminal, not terminal in grammar. Do you see what I'm saying? And you can say that you are done with your planning if you have a plan that is only contains the primitive actions and it is a correct plan. That means there are no interactions, there are no flaws. We can notice here that this is actually, and notice by the way, there is a hitchhike source to destination I put in here. And there is no way of reaching it from the travel. So if you are only using the primitive actions, you can actually get hitchhike way of going to destination. But you lose that when you do it standard ways. That's the interesting point. When you do things in the standard ways, you miss the MacGyver plans. Right? And hitchhiking or standing on somebody's car, like the side when their car is driving, going away. Those are all weirdo ways of traveling. It would be nice to see this in a TV serial, but your wife and your parents and your husband would be very unhappy if this is the way you are generally traveling to your office. You know what I'm saying? The standard ways are more robust and they have less accidents and all that stuff. You see what I'm saying? Right? So basically, so remember this one. Basically, the hitchhike SD is not connected to this top one, and that's possible. Okay. So there are two notions of completeness. One is, of course, schema completeness, which is do the schemas actually capture all the kinds of solutions that the user wanted to capture, whatever the domain writer wanted to capture. You see what I'm saying? And so obviously in this particular case, it's not capturing hitchhike. But if the user didn't want it to be, if the domain writer didn't want to include hitchhiking, then they're fine in not including it. Because they didn't want MacGyver plans from this planner. The other is planner completeness. That is, will you find every plan, that actually could be found by that could be found basically that's consistent with the task reduction schemas. If your algorithm is wrongly designed, then you will even miss those plans. You see what I'm saying? So those are the two notions you talk about. And so the modeling task reduction schema, so the go by bus, essentially, I wrote it like this so that it will be easier to see, but really go by bus looks like that. It's actually a partial plan fragment. Right? This is like you have a subroutine and then you put the subroutine body in the place of the subroutine. That's how you think of subroutine calls in programming, right? So similarly, whenever you see go by bus, in essence, you could replace the go by bus with this partial plan. the interesting thing is this partial plan has some dependencies inside and it has some external dependencies which you need to connect it up from the parent, from the non-primitive task. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the partial plan that I gave has to be correct in a semantic sense. It's a reasonable, it's a correct way to do going by bus. Just as how do you know that it's correct way? The writer said this is correct. The domain writer said it's a correct way. The same way, like if some domain writer gave you a PDDL action where they forgot to include some effect or some precondition, that's their mistake. You will still be only found, your planner would become, your planner would be penalized only if in fact the plan is possible in the domain model and you didn't find it. If the domain model was wrongly written, that's okay. That's the problem of the guy who gave the domain model. Right? So, in this case, basically, this is what the guy gave, the domain writer gave. That whenever you have go by bus, there is one way of reducing it, and this is called a task reduction schema. And the task reduction schema says, if you have go by bus, you can always replace it with this partial plan fragment. And this partial plan fragment essentially can have both primitive and non-primitive actions. In this particular case, to me, they look like primitive actions, but it doesn't have to be, yes.
So do you start with the goal in this hierarchical abstraction?
Again, you're asking. Remember, that's the reason I said the whole thing. First understand what is being given, and then understand how are you going to use it. The answer to your question is exactly what I was telling you here earlier, which is you could use it top down or you could use it bottom up. And there are two very different ways of using the same information. Yes, yeah. Right? I mean, obviously it's a lot more intuitive to use abstraction by starting from the top or going down. Right? But as I said, there are issues which I'll be talking more completely about, and so in fact it's better to sometimes do things cleanly as a grammar. Yes?
Or I can ask when the slide's done, because you didn't mention the stuff at the bottom yet.
Which one? So this is angelic uncertainty is what I just told you earlier.
But
A whole bunch of stuff on this has already been said.
But
So-
how is that related when these are all conjunctions instead of disjunctions?
No, the disjunction is the different, no. This is a single partial plan. But if there are different ways of going by bus, that would be the disjunction between the two partial plan fragments.
So right now we have no.
We only have just one. I showed you one task reduction schema.
Okay.
If there is a different way of going by bus, for example,
Okay. But this slide itself.
it didn't show the disjunction.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Right? And also, if in fact in this slide, if one of this, imagine buy ticket. Again, as I said, one man's abstraction is another man's concrete. You might think, I know how to buy ticket. But I've been to places in Europe where nobody knows how the heck to buy a ticket. Right? So, it could be that the buy the ticket is actually a non-primitive action for Americans. If the executor is an American, they need to be explained how to do the buy ticket action. I actually don't, in fact, this one is getting in the bus and buying the ticket. So it turns out that many a time the drivers glare at you if you try to kind of ask the driver to sell you a ticket. Right? And in fact, in some cases, you go buy the ticket by kind of showing your credit card in the middle of the bus. And in some places, you do something else. And so there are multiple ways of buying the ticket. And so in which case, you could have made buy the ticket be listed as a non-primitive action. In which case, the way you show that it's a non-primitive action is that it has ways of being reduced further. And if there is ever any non-primitive action, that is actually disjunction already. Because the different ways, again, imagine the go by bus came because you're trying to travel from Phoenix to San Francisco. So basically, the bigger picture is travel from Phoenix to San Francisco, which got reduced to go by bus, which got reduced to this. Now the travel from Phoenix to San Francisco has two different ways of doing it already. That's disjunction. And the whole point is anytime you have a non-primitive action, there is a disjunction. Because there are different ways of doing that action. Yes?
First off, follow up. If the go by action only has one set of three things you can do, is it still considered primitive because there's no disjunction, or is it not?
Which one? No, what are you talking about?
Like the go by bus action?
No, go by bus action, basically this is the sub-plan for this.
But if there's only one way to go by bus, is it?
But I mean, the point is it matters as to whether the agent knows that or not.
Sure, if the agent
And
does.
if the agent doesn't know, then you're telling me what exactly are the steps. It depends ultimately on whether the executor knows how to do each of the actions that are named. If it doesn't know how to do go by bus action and it knows how these things are done, those are the only primitive actions. So you need to bring it down to primitive level. Right? I mean, it is possible that there is only one good way to write the paper. Right? And I tell my student, just write the paper. And they look like me like this still. Because it's obvious to me that there is one good way of writing the paper, but it's still not obvious to them. So I still have to say what that means is do this and do this and do this and do this. And that becomes primitive. And one of the interesting things you can argue is as you do this after a while, maybe by the seventh paper they can just be told, just do the paper. Which is true here too. But in general we are talking about given the current schemas, how do you do the plan? You see what I'm saying? So because abstraction can change when the current underlying agent becomes better and better at taking higher level instructions, right? Okay. So then basically the minimal requirements for a reduction schema are the following. A reduction schema R is valid for reducing a task T if for every effect of the task T there is some task T dash in R which gives that effect. Because if your dad made promises, one of the kids are stuck with it in this scenario, right? And similarly, for every so every effect of the task T, there is some task which gives that effect, and it doesn't have to be the same task for each effect, because the thing is there for taking effects, and you should essentially make sure that because that thing was put into the plan to kind of say, because it says after go from Phoenix to San Francisco, there is an effect called you are in San Francisco, and you had a goal in San Francisco. So you put in this, let's say, this action going downwards, right? And so this action now is giving an effect in San Francisco, but when you reduce it, one of these three guys better say in San Francisco as its effect. If nobody does, then the big guy made promises, none of the small guys are keeping it. The other question, of course, is preconditions. That preconditions actually we'll talk only in terms of causal links. For every causal link and the precedence constraint T that T takes part in, there is a task T dash in R that constraints must be redirected to. So basically you have to redirect the links as well as the precedences. Right? For example, what was happening was you might have had T1, T2, T1 before T2 before T3 in the plan. T2 got split into this plan. Now T1 is before this, T3 is before this, and if T2 is giving, let's say, Q to this, one of these guys better be giving Q to 3. That's it. Very reasonable. Right? Yes?
How would the reduction schema look if you introduce temporal constraints to it?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
One at a time.
Okay.
Right? This is bad enough already, but yes, there are lots of other problems if you have temporal constraints, etc. Completely true. Okay. So let's do this. And then the properties of schemas versus plans should be separated in this. Okay, the schema, the planner, soundness, it only returns plans that have a valid parse in terms of the task reduction schemas and solve the problem. Right? Completeness must be able to return all the sound plans. That means everything that is actually valid and parsable, you should be able to return. That's when the hierarchical task network planner is considered correct. So the fact that it didn't find the hitchhiking plan is not a strike against it, because hitchhiking plan is not possible. Do you understand what I'm saying? Right? Schema. So my biggest point is saying I want to only search with abstract actions and saying I'm losing completeness is nonsensical. When you abstract, sometimes you lose completeness, because there are these crazy ways of doing plans that basically you remove, because those are like non-standard ways of doing things. But non-standard ways, the word standard essentially just says non-standard ways most of the time won't be done, but if the world is ending. Right? For example, right, it turns out that the way to go from Dubai to US is to take either Emirates or whatever random airline that came to DBX. Tell that to the bozos who are got stuck in Dubai airport right now. Some of them, for example, tweet on the Twitter saying, please take us out from here. And then, for example, people who are, I know of people who are actually US citizens, but also Indian overseas citizens, I mean, they're originally from India. And they made enough of a complaint that India sent Air India flight to Dubai to pick them up. And then they go to Delhi, from which they buy a separate ticket to come to New York. Saying that my travel agent never suggested this plan to me is nonsensical, because your travel agent didn't expect certain presidents declaring certain wars. Right? Lots of things can happen in the world. Standard ways of going from Dubai to US is just direct come from Dubai to US. There are like a million flights from Dubai to US. But there's nothing standard right now in the last several days. And you can basically, and so the non-standard ones will become the only ones left at that time. They are not preferred. This is not what anybody would like to do or would even get to do. But that's the only thing that was left. That's what standardization and abstraction means. Most of the time they work well. But in push comes to shove, you will get into trouble. Right? Okay? Again, I mean, if you're into this sort of stuff, watch any of these movies about the end of the world, like Testament or anything which is about after nuclear holocaust or something. Nothing is standard. Right? You want gas, there is no gas station left. You want to send a message to somebody, there is no internet left. It's not that you just give up right away. You will still find the MacGyver plans. But those were not the plans that your hierarchical planner was supposed to suggest to you. Right? Okay. Schema soundness is every solution having a valid parse is actually liked by the user. This is just domain writer is saying if you give a plan that is parsable, then people will be happy. You understand what I'm saying? That's the way the capturing of the user preferences is being done. So whose problem is that? That is the domain writer's problem, not yours. If you do their plans, then if they don't get this correct, then it's between the domain writer and the user population. Completeness, every solution that the users likes will have a valid parse. You see what I'm saying? If your user population is one of those populations which would like to oftentimes go from Dubai to Delhi and come from Delhi to US, a large number of 15% of the cases there are enough such users, then you have to consider that as one of the preferred plans for some part of your user population. You see what I'm saying? So if you didn't, then you get to be yelled at by your users, you the domain writer. And whenever I say domain writer, eventually we want to replace the domain writer with a learning algorithm. And then you have to ask yourself, how does the learning algorithm guarantee that stuff either? Yes.
In the earlier example you gave, on the board, when you were talking about
Domain is a full
airspace,
circle. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
the airspace being closed and open affects the validity of the plan. Is that related to grammar? Like, you know, what if airspace was a precondition in your lecture?
No, no, no. But what I'm saying is these. I mean, you're talking about the Dubai thing. So the idea is the standard ways that the domain writer thought they have to capture of coming from Dubai to US are all the different flight options. There are no train, not yet, right? And there's no walking, etc. And there's no driving. So basically, they just as long as they consider all possible flight options, there are already many different ways. You know, the ones which go clockwise or anti-clockwise, you know, east versus west, etc. And all those things, if they capture those, then they're done. But it turns out that you are in a non-standard situation. But the whole point of non-standard is they'll only happen very, very few times. And at that time, you throw your standard planner out. And what then, if you think there are non-standard things are going to happen, you know, it's like, you know, if you're one of those people who say, just because you are not paranoid doesn't mean they aren't out to get you. You understand what I just said? Then you'll be a prepper. Preppers actually have plan B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O for everything because they assume that things are never going to be standard. And we would be the only people that would be left in this world. We make sure by having this contingency to contingency to contingency. Of course, preppers have a pretty sad life because it's just a number of contingencies to contingencies to contingencies. It's just so hard that you will never have any fun in life. Like, you know, standardized plans are much simpler. Yes?
So, like, from my own experience, I had a non-standard thing happen. Like, I got stuck in San Diego because they delayed my flight, and it was interfering with obligations of the next day. So, basically what I'm getting at is the actual solution is not necessarily to throw out your well, it is to throw out the abstraction, but you retrieve another one. Like, my plan B is call my mom and get the abstraction from her of what to do. And so that's basically, I'm retrieving a new schema from another source.
Okay, that's an entirely different issue. Basically, there are like multiple things that you can do. One, of course, is these are expandable domain models. For everything you said for HTML, notice that the reason I bring this up is, again, everything is little more natural than strips planning. Strips planning, nobody asks me any questions. They're just happy with, oh, the actions, preconditions, are done. Okay. But actually, you could have asked, man, did you give all the preconditions? Did you give all the effects even there itself? But you did. And then when you came to the time, already you realized that your normal planning is actually temporal. And so you have a lot more interesting intuitions. Then you come to hierarchical task method planning, you have even more, questioning, because you actually live by this. And in fact, what you just said is dynamically expanding domain model. Okay, that can be there for strips too. If there's a new action that has been found, you just add it to the list of actions. And there's a much simpler way, by the way, which you also can do, which is you can say that the preferred plans are just listed first, and then all the non-preferred plans can still be there. So it's like you might say that if the hierarchical planner doesn't find a plan, then you find the normal, you call the normal planner, which just only works in the primitive actions there. And if there is a primitive action plan, you find it. You see what I'm saying? That is a possibility. Then basically, then you no longer are having these categorical things like either preferred or nothing at all. They say we'll try for preferred first. If they're not there, then we'll try for non-standard ones, which is basically anything else that the lower level planner does. Right? Okay. Wow, this color is becoming better and better. So the validity requirements are flowing downwards. That means there can be effects of task T dash and R that are not mentioned in the effects of T. That means the lower level guys might have more effects than the higher level guys. You see what I'm saying? That's part of the abstraction. The higher level tasks don't have to say everything that can happen in the lower level. They need to just give the important things that will happen. So for example, if you go from here to San Francisco, you will be in San Francisco. That's the high level effect. But depending on the way you go to San Francisco, a bunch of other things might also be true. Such as if you went by bus, then you might be somewhat more smelly because you traveled so long in a bus. And if you went on a plane, you also may be a little drunk because you had a couple of extra drinks on the plane. All of these are happening at the lower level. And one of the interesting things is these effects, if you even want to list them at the high level, they will become disjunctive effects. Right? Because depending on the actual reduction, you will get those effects. So, but in general, in writing the tasks themselves, the top level task effects have to be inherited by the lower level tasks. But lower level tasks can mention new effects that are not in the top level. And those are the more concrete things, more specialized things, right? So the semantics of the primitive plans with the non-primitive actions. This is actually candidate set semantics. Remember we talked about refinement planning, you read the paper on refinement planning, you can talk about a plan with an action, for example. If you have a plan, partial plan with it starts, begin A, end, and so beginning is before A and A is before end. Then it corresponds to all action sequences that have at least one A in them. That's it. That's the constraint. Right? And similarly, if you have an abstract action, it would correspond to basically having all its concretizations, a disjunction of all its concretizations. A concretization is starting from that, going to its next level, going to its next level, going to its next level, until the partial plan that you get has no non-primitive actions anymore. So for any given task, there can be a finite number, especially if there is no looping, a finite number of concretizations. And those are all partial plans. And so you are saying, so a simplest way is suppose go by bus, suppose I have an action called go by bus, it corresponds to either action A1 or A2, that's it. Then you know that essentially, basically the candidate set is the union of get money A1 buy Wisconsin cheese, is like one plan. That's the candidate set of that plan. Union get money A2 buy Wisconsin cheese. Okay, and so you take the union of the two, you get the union of the A1 or A2. Now, of course, I understand everybody is wondering where the heck did the Wisconsin cheese come from? Wisconsin cheese comes for historical reasons. I wrote this paper called Hybrid Hierarchical Planning. We presented it in Wisconsin, Madison, in AAAI 1998, which is the only time I've ever been to Wisconsin. Actually, it's such a nice place, I guess, but Madison is a lovely, lovely town, but especially in summer. But and so I made that example for Wisconsin cheese. Even as I was looking at it, I was thinking, why am I talking about Wisconsin cheese? But that was the reason. So apparently, I went to MSN is Madison. Okay, there you go. Everything has been. But anyway, so the modeling, essentially all we are saying is you had a go by bus became this, and which is get in bus and buy ticket and get out, and then the total plan might actually be get money, go by bus, and buy Wisconsin cheese. That's my top level plan. That then becomes get money, this entire partial plan, and buy Wisconsin cheese. And then I do the doctoring as to who gives the effects and who becomes the consumer of the causal. You see what I'm saying? Okay? So notice that this is extremely easy to understand from the point of view of plan space planning. Right? Because I'm just doing causal link planning, except instead of just having normal actions, I also have non-primitive actions. So in fact, HTM planning was originally understood only as just, in fact, crazier yet, the first planner after strips The strips which you know, which I talked about, the mean sense analysis planner. The first planner after strips is NOVA by Sacerdote. That actually is hierarchical task network planner. And then they did all sorts of random things, etc. And then people figured out that it can actually be split into partial order planning plus this whole hierarchy part separately. Okay. This is the slide that I could have just come to it, but now you know why I wrote that slide. Right? The dual views of HDN planning. The one that you would like to believe is capturing hierarchical structure of the domains. It motivates top-down planning. If it's hierarchical structure, hierarchy always goes from top to bottom. Right? And so start with the abstract plans and reduce them. But the problem is there are many technical headaches in doing it right. And one of which is respecting user intent, maintaining systematicity and minimality, and also phantomization, also random other issues like downward unlinearizability, etc. In general, it's like a mess to actually get the algorithm to be right. In any complex enough, schema scenarios. Right? But people had like task network planners developed like this. But they were So then the other way of looking at it basically is capturing expert advice about desirable solutions, which is what I was telling you. I mean, you can say that user preferences are expert advice about desirable solutions. These are the standard solutions. You should try to look for the standard solutions. Right? And motivates bottom-up planning. And it ensures that each partial plan being considered is legal with respect to the reduction schemas. That means it is parsable. Directly usable with disjunctive planning example, and that's kind of less important. But the point is, since the engine is the normal planner, it's one of the planners that you love, which is like either progression, other regression, other plan space, mostly plan space. And on top of it, you have another module checking over the shoulder of the planner. Over the shoulder of the planner, search space, checking whether it's still possible. And one of the interesting things is this one, connection to efficiency, is not obvious at all. This one looks like it is definitely efficient, but it winds up not being efficient because of all the problems. This one, it looks like, it seems harder than normal planning. Instead of just generating plans, I'm also checking whether they're grammatically correct. That should be harder. Do you see what I'm saying? But on the other hand, if the space of standard plans is smaller than the space of all plans, then this can actually cut down the search space quite a bit too. Interestingly enough, yes. You had a question?
I was just going to ask if it's because you're doing research space.
Exactly. Okay. So this is, by the way, Barrett and Weld 1994 paper. You can go read that. Okay. So it's a 97 actually. So relative advantages are not exactly clear, but honestly, given the complexities, this is actually a much simpler thing. And at a minimum, think of abstraction as a grammar, because you never thought so before. You always thought abstraction is going from top to bottom. But most interesting abstractions have all sorts of corner cases, so it's actually simpler to think of them as a grammar of useful solutions. And that's actually a more general view of abstraction. Finally, this, and then you get to take a break. This is the one which has, I'll show you a plan which seems dead in the water at the abstract level, and so you kill it and you throw it away, but then it turns out it's actually alive in the concrete level. Right? So here basically there is A and B are the abstract actions. And it turns out that I have a partial plan. This is the initial state. This is I and G. This is a plan space plan, right? So I gives P to A, R to B, B gives S to G, A gives Q to G, and A deletes R, and B deletes P. Right? And so you can, you should be able to figure out that this plan is dead. Right? In plan space planning, if you get this plan like this, this plan is dead because you cannot actually, resolve both the unsafe states. Right? And yet, so that means you would like to kill it here. The only difference between this and normal plan space planning is in normal plan space planning, these two will be primitive actions. Here, this is A and B. If you allow A, it can bring in its own huge, big partial plan. Right? So I actually will make a very simple partial plan. It turns out A is just nothing but A1 before A2. And B is nothing but B1 before B2. And then I will basically say, remember I said the schema should tell who gets the effects and who gets the causal links. That's part of telling the schema. Unless you put like a default rule saying only one action gets it. So imagine the schema said that the first guys get all the causal links and the last guys give all the effects. Right? Which is a very reasonable thing to do. Right? So then you wind up having I is giving P to A1, R to B1, and then A2 is giving Q and B2 is giving S to G. Now A1 and A2 and B1 and B2, they're not, you can actually linearize this plan such that there are no interactions. But there was an interaction because it looked like A and B are indivisible. Right? But A and B are not indivisible. A and B kind of expanded to A1, A2, B1, B2, such that the debts and assets of A and B are split over their descendants. Because of which the failure there did become a failure. Again, it's a theoretical point, but that also tells you that there exist cases where an abstract plan is basically already dead, and yet there is a concrete plan that's not dead. Which essentially means that if you're actually doing hierarchical top-down planning, then this is not, you don't get to kill this plan right away. Which beggars the question of why do you have abstraction? If you can't kill the abstract plans that are not doable, then why have the abstraction? Who are you trying to impress? You see what I'm saying? So the way you can avoid this is, as I said, imagine that basically you use a rule that says whoever gets the debts also gets the assets. That's it. Whoever gets the debts also gets the assets. Right? That would basically be like sort of the primogeniture law. Right? And then basically that would be, you could then say that every high-level task has primitive tasks, which basically high-level tasks are less high-level tasks, such that there exists in the reduction there exists a unique sub-action which gets all the debts and the things. The moment you do that, then you know that if you couldn't solve it here, you can't solve it here. And it's not surprising, as I said earlier, and kind of what somebody else also say it again, is basically this one can be connected to the notion of temporal gap in the temporal planning. It's like a connection. It doesn't give you extra insights, but essentially, in a weird way, hierarchical actions are temporal. Right? Like we were basically talking about how to look at strips planning from the point of view of temporal planning. Remember, there was one slide, and we thought either they can be instantaneous or they can be epsilons. Either which way, this plan is now becoming bigger plan. I mean, one single action is becoming a bigger plan. So in some sense, hierarchical actions already have some implicit notion of time, not metric time, but simple implicit notion of time. So it's not surprising that the temporal gap leaves its ugly head there. But I'm telling the history in the complete reverse order. Right? This work was done by a guy called Chang Yang, who used to be my lab mate. This is as ancient as that. Lab mate when I was a PhD student. And this was and he wrote a paper about that in 1997 or something. No, not 1997, Yeah, 1992 or something, because I got done in 89. Okay. And then temporal gap stuff that I mentioned, that name temporal gap was invented by me in 2007. So I'm just sort of combining these two things. I mean, the semantics can flow backwards, like basically in terms of making connections. But that's why I was saying that it was techniques. Okay. The two other things, actually, I did mention it, but let me tell you these two things because I mentioned those two, and then you take a 15-minute break. One is this phantom establishments. As I already said, each condition is considered only once for establishment in any normal planning scenario. At that time, if everybody who can potentially give it hasn't been taken into a separate branch, then you can lose completeness. In plan space planning, you do that by considering simple establishment from every action that can give the condition, right? And then every action that can give condition, and also every new action from the library that can give the condition, and each corresponds to a separate branch, right? This corresponds to a separate branch. The problem basically in the temporal, the non-primitive actions is, remember, they don't have to say everything that their descendants will wind up giving. So you would have to assume that even if in fact none of the non-primitive actions act as if they're going to give this condition, you have to assume that one of them might actually give it accidentally. So to do that, you will essentially assume that a goal can also become satisfied by a phantom contributor. Beautiful terminology. And so you put like dot, dot, dot around it. And so it's a phantom, it's just waiting there. And then as you go down, at some point of time, let's say you actually wind up getting, under that reduction, an actual task which has the effect that you want, then you say, you are the phantom. It's hard to say weird things to do, right? It looks basically as if you are falling over backwards to just make sure that the problems that exist in the hierarchical task network things, because these things are like simple establishment cannot be done unless you know what the effects are. Interestingly, so that's one way of doing. So this is basically the way phantomization was written up in all the old hierarchical task network planners, because you don't know what effects are. But actually, a newer way of thinking about it is, if you know the non-primitive task, you know all possible ways it gets actually, so you know how to compute the concretizations. It's what I was doing for the semantics. If you compute the concretizations, then you can take everything that occurs in those concretizations as a possible effect. Not a guaranteed effect, but a possible effect. Right? And so you kind of know what are the things that can possibly become accidentally or serendipitously true when you are actually finally reducing these tasks. But there is a disjunction over that, and all of this disjunction is actually, angelic. I'm sorry. Okay. And then similarly, changes to the conflict resolutions. Basically, once again, if A is giving P to B and C is deleting P, you don't right away get to resolve that constraint problem, because C might become a whole forest of actions. And you need to know which of its descendants is actually giving the nothing. So the bigger point of it is you can do top-down hierarchical task network planning, but you have to consider all these weirdo subcases. Or you can give up and just say, let's assume HTMs are just, parsers over the plan. Writing a parsing algorithm for HTML schemas is painful, but once you write it, you're done. I'm not saying that you're writing either of these, but at least you can understand the duality, abstraction versus grammar. So that is, so that is basically a bottom-up HTML planning. Use a normal planner to generate solutions and verify that the solutions are parsed by vector schemas. And as described this way, HTML planning can never be, doesn't look obviously like it can be faster than the normal planning. But as you said, it might sometimes happen if in fact a large amount of pruning occurs, because there's more ungrammatical sentences than grammatical sentences that are valid semantically. Okay. So I'll end with this and we'll come back and look at this. Thoroughly mixed motivations for HDL planning. Everybody thinks it's all about abstraction, and I hope I completely confuse the heck out of you, saying that it is in fact both abstraction and the grammar. And you can close your eyes and forget the complexity of the word, but that's not the point of any course. Right? So we'll stop here. And three gentlemen, the two there, you, and that guy in blue shirt, please come and talk. And you probably know why, but you'll come and talk. Thank you. Just
So then, can I just go early today?
go. That's
Okay.
right. Go.
And I have
We'll record
questions.
it, yeah.
Yeah, I have two questions about the midterm. Like next week, is it?
I will
gonna be
send a
like-
message about
yeah,
that.
Is it gonna be like announcement?
I will send a
Like,
message about
yeah.
that, yes, yeah.
All right, thank
Go.
you so much.
Just 1 second. Okay, sirs. You know why I'm doing this? Because I can ask any question about what I discussed in the class and you'll all fall directly on your feet, on your faces, because you completely spend the entire damn time doing whatever the heck that you wanted to do. So you actually are not present, and you're worse than not being present because you are distracting me. I'm not used to having people, when I pour my heart out, I'm not used to having people doing their homeworks or random things here. So not only are you not getting attendance, but you're actually worse off, honestly. So can you please tell me your names? What's your name?
Fancy number.
Francie?
Yeah.
Just 1 second. What's your last name? M?
Right there.
This one, okay. And you?
Boz Judge, last name J. Right there.
And then you, sir?
Luca, M-I-C-E-B-I-C.
Okay. So please understand the reason is, I don't care what the heck you want to do with your time. You don't need to pass this course. You don't need to take this course. I don't really care. I care in as much as you distract the heck out of me. Because I'm not used to droning on when people are paying attention. Okay, so every once in a while I have to sort of close my eyes to not look at you guys, because you are like completely in a different world. And you know this. Yeah. Because I can ask any damn question now and you basically have no idea what I discussed in the class. And that's insulting and that's disruptive. So it's worse than not attending the class.
Yeah.
Please don't ever do it again. If you want to not attend, just don't attend. You will take the no attendance. That's fine. At least you would not have, I would not have any negative opinion of you beyond just attendance. Right now, I have a pretty damn negative opinion of you.
Okay.
Just as you would if you are teaching and I basically did something else completely. Please understand. Okay? You are not born yesterday. Yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience, Professor. It won't happen again.
You mentioned that grammar that is being learned over the abstraction. Are there any papers that define this grammar over abstractions that
It's a
are
grammar,
over
so you
continuous?
can read-
No,
what?
that are over continuous space. Like in case of classic motion planning, there are abstractions that are over continuous
Yeah, it
space.
becomes harder. First of all, it's not, yeah, it's a harder thing. I mean, again, it's an interesting thing that, what does it mean to have reduction schemas there? But interesting thing that I can tell you is whenever anybody talks about abstraction, they have all these problems in a different guise. They just push it under the rug. Right? People basically just say, oh, we did abstraction, we are happy. But they never talk about all these other things that
But are there people that are learning these or
okay, learning
defining these
abstractions
grammar?
is an entirely different thing.
No,
entirely
defining
different
these
thing.
grammar over these abstractions over continuous space. This specific case.
I don't directly know
Okay.
because that's basically, there's not, honestly, one of the problems is for the continuous spaces like motion planning, we don't normally have explicit preferences. We may have implicit preferences, we may not have explicit preferences. So the preference for example, in motion planning, there's a preference for straight line motion where possible. So if it is actually, and so that has basically that leads to things like legibility. So for example, if I am walking and you are like two people and then the agent is walking, right, and you're trying to figure out which point is it going to, then if it is going like this, then you assume it's going to go that way, even though nothing stops the agent from going like this and going like this and going like this and going like this and stuff. So the idea is the standard motion is, if the standard motion is straight line, then the current straight line, I assume I just extend it and assume that's where you're trying to go. So much of legibility literature basically just sort of takes that into consideration. Basically, the model basically that the user has is that the straight line is what the standard motion is. Okay, but in general, there is no obvious thing that I can think of. Okay. But learning abstractions is a whole entire extra issue, and you need to think about how some of these things actually become. I mean, the reality is that most people ignore most problems, as against they just say we just did abstraction or something. And again, one of the other interesting things is how serious are you about the abstraction? If you don't care. So one of the things is I could basically, I set my thing in such a way that I could differentiate between hitchhiking plan and the only plans that are allowed by the abstract, the preferences, such as go by car and go by train and go by plane, etc. But if you just basically listen to all the advice and give a plan that may or may not even be correct, and if it is correct, you take credit, which is what LLMs get to do, then notice that one of the other things is LLMs have no sense of quality of the plan in terms of the optimality, etc. It's a much harder thing. We're just happy that they come with the plans. And again, which is completely fine given their generality, but if you're trying to replace it with a domain-specific planner, replace a domain-specific planner with it, they won't do that. Just as you can't replace a calculator with LLMs. They're like broad and shallow. They can do at a certain high level. I don't know if that answered your question, but that's the key point. Yeah.
And the limitations that you talked about in these abstractions about the upward solution and the downward refinability, are there works that go into proving these? Like if there exists an abstraction, how they prove?
Yeah, they do, but most of the cases they are not useful. I mean, this is, they can be proved. Again, much of this work basically is like many years old, and and people just, one of the things that people did is they just, it's like the usual thing that the difference between a computer scientist and a hacker is the computer scientist knows what are the good properties, and then might say, oh, to heck with it, it's too painful to guarantee them. And then a hacker doesn't actually even know, doesn't even think about the properties, in which case it does what it does. Okay, so we are currently, of course, in the it does what it does phase, but even in the middle, in fact, in the entire world right now, in the HTN planning, there's only one group that cares about HTN planning, honestly. That is this guy in Australia, ANU, Pascal Bircher. He's pretty much the only guy who does it, and it's not very clear why it is interesting the way he does it, but so he's just he did his thesis and he has like an entire group, and he keeps holding workshops which are about 7 or 3 people. So in general, ICAP's community is like full of this sort of a thing. They sometimes have workshops with a few people, but he's doing that essentially. So not too many people are actually doing HTN planning at all. And then the other people who don't even actually care about giving any guarantees, like the LLM folks.
Thank you. Professor, I have a good question. Could you just go to the slide where you have the abstractions are? Diagram, you were talking about go by ticket.
What happened?
Yeah.
That one. Mm-hmm.
So, let's say, when you're trying to build bottom up, so are you saying that?
So you're not bottom up. All you're doing in the bottom up is plan space planner will be generating partial plans.
Mm-hmm.
right? You remember the plan space planning thing. It will just actually be generating partial plans in terms of these tasks.
Yeah.
Instead of normal just steps. The steps now in the plan space planning would be these tasks. Okay, and and then there are two things. It basically, in addition to what it was doing before, right, it also needs to make sure that when it stops, everything, all the tasks are primitive. That's an extra thing, because in the past you don't need to check because all the tasks were primitive anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, actually no, I completely made a mistake. So plan space planning only generates plans in the primitive actions.
Yeah.
Okay, so even though there are all these get in the bus, I mean, like the go by bus,
Yeah.
it doesn't think in terms of go by bus at all. It only thinks in terms of the primitive actions. Right, so imagine there are primitive actions and there are hierarchical actions which then get reduced to eventually the primitive actions.
Yeah.
Plan space planner for a domain will just be acting as if it is like a normal plan space planner. That means it doesn't look at the non-primitive tasks at all. There is an extra critique on this plan space planner, which is basically the critique has the task reduction schemas, and it is checking whether or not the current partial plan still has valid parses. Right?
Yeah.
That's basically what is happening. So you are writing, in the grammar, in the Google Doc analogy, you are writing words that you will write. You are not thinking in terms of what phrase, noun phrase, some other phrase, etc. You're just writing words the way you write.
Yeah.
And then the background, it is looking at the words you are putting, the sequence of words, and seeing, does it still have at least one grammatical parse? Whenever, and you don't even know what the grammar is.
Yeah.
It knows. Because it has the grammar rule. Similarly, the critique for these guys, critique for the plan space planner, I'll send you that paper, you can read if you're interested. The critique for the plan space planner is the only one that has the task reduction schemas. And then it is basically checking if the current primitive partial plan is still has a life left in it. Right? Previously it could be dead because it has, it has ordering constraints, basically causal links that have unsafe links that can't be resolved.
Yeah.
Now there is one other way of killing the plan, which is it has no parses left.
Also,
And it's when it came out, nobody believed that this would be an efficient enough approach, but it's actually not bad. It's just more painful to write the algorithm, but it's actually good.
And my mind is a little stuck on the grammar. So, for instance, so in this case, if you have go by bus, then you have go by bus maps to A, get out, and A maps to B, get B, buy ticket, and B maps to get in. And you generate the grammar out of that? Or
No. My point is that, again, you have to, maybe we have to do this because I have to do other things, but so each task reduction schema, so the basic idea about grammar essentially is you might say, NT, non-terminal can be written as non-terminal followed by is followed by non-terminal. And non-terminal can also be written as RU non-terminal. Question mark.
Yeah.
Like this. Okay, if this is the only grammar, then I started writing something like let's say R and then wrote cat. Then it will already say this it can't pass. This it can't pass with this. There are no passes. Anything has any pass is good enough. So you are keeping track of incremental pass trees.
Yeah.
It's a pretty painful thing to do, but that's basically what incremental error check, incremental, the things that whatever your ID is, which basically tell you whether, as you're typing, if your program is still syntactically correct. And also the grammar thing, which as you're typing a sentence, is it correct? Those are both basically using classes. And you might think that like language has a harder problem for your grammar, but you know that formal languages have well-known grammars because every computer language has a well-known vectors now form grammar. And so that's the one that they're using to compute incremental parses and then see if any of the parses, as long as there's at least one parse, it's still essentially syntactic because based on the way you extend, it may still be possible. But if it currently already doesn't have any parses, then you can't extend it to make it have parses. Which is basically the same idea you feel except for the reduction schemas are the grammars. No, it makes sense. The reduction schemas are the grammars. Next one. Okay. Acharya Varadapur.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anvika Tejas. Anvika Tejas. Arya Dhitam. Dhitam Arya. Usam Chu. Soham Cholwar. Vivek Reddy. Shrek Ajay. Vardhan. Venkata Gumadi, Gabriel Habib, Rowan Holder, George Joby, Marco Joji, Eman Jang, Sai Kambalapalli, Ravi Karimuri, Inshuan Lu, Kush Manchanda, Ram Menon, Sarthak Mishra, Nived Mudiam, Sanya Mula, Jayesh Nagpal, Neem Nguyen, Manav, Skand Parvatikar, Jaya Pauluri, Ishita Kadakami Devi, Karnya Prasad, James Price, Ryan Pua, Rahil Muhammad, Arjun Rajan, Moha Prathod, Yash Sawan, William Serovic, Taha Shahid, Ashish Shekhar, Rodney Staggers, Jonathan Stedham, Ethan Tang, Manya Tiwari, Neat Ram, Vrinda Uday Kumar, John Woods, Saeed Azomar. Okay, thank you. It has been recording all this well. Oh well, great. Okay. Okay. Yeah, now since I said the harder one, then I'll also spend some time for the rest of the class, the next half an hour or so, talking about the simpler ones, all of which can be seen as variations of this, than they came earlier. They're like, but this is like the more complex version of hierarchical abstraction that's used in planning, at least in the PDL planning. Like I said, the thoroughly mixed motivation is, of course, you can either think of it as allowing for the abstraction hierarchy in modeling, or you can think of it as providing a grammar for standard or desirable solutions. And then basically in terms of abstract hierarchy, you might say the model partial domain knowledge, because one of the reasons you might do abstraction is sometimes you don't know all the details, and so you kind of have an abstract plan that sort of works, and then you make the rest work by trial and error during the execution, which is something that actually in one of the things that we are, so basically you stop at a certain level of abstraction, and then that plan, then basically you would actually try to execute one of its correct disjunctions in the real world. Okay, as against going all the way until everything becomes primitive, and then at that point you just execute them directly. Okay, so this allows for actually there is a whole area which I might come back to called hierarchical reinforcement learning, which is very closely connected to this. And essentially what it does is the hierarchy acts like the task interactions can be, in their case, they act sort of like biases towards, try these areas for the policy. Okay, and then within that area, then it will still do actual exploration, etc. Okay, the agent will do exploration. The other is abstraction is used really only for speed up, which is the other motivation. That's what lots of people think HDN planning is. But it's actually just as useful to think in this way. And then the third one is, of course, to provide a grammar for desirable solutions. Really, I can, as I said, this is the only thing I can say for sure is true for HDN planning. General abstraction, there will be other abstractions might actually have other properties. For HDN planning, this is really is the only thing that's true. But then that becomes a question of, if you give an HDN schemas, who guarantees that these schemas actually correspond to what users care about? That is, what I said, schema completeness. How do you get that? It's bad enough to say you gave a PDL model. How do you know that it's the correct model of the world? And then there's this question of, you're also now guessing what are the standard procedures. And so it becomes harder to actually say anything about that. Okay, and it's also, I kind of said, if you think of HDNs as preferences, then you can think of it as basically parsing. But if you are assuming that all you are into is looking for preferences, there are other ways of dealing with preferences, which is basically not all plans are created equal, and there is like a sort of an ordering over good versus bad plans, and that doesn't have to be like categorical, right? And that's to say, like, you can essentially have extra soft constraints. Soft constraints is one way of talking about preferences. Okay, so make these things true and make these other implicit constraints true as much as possible, right? In which case the idea would be that it would be good if you try to use standard operation procedures for flying, but really what I care about is you are able to reach San Francisco. And if there exists a plan that could have worked with the standard, and you still came up with the non-standard one, that's like you get blamed. But if there wasn't any, then you just basically, of the ones that are possible, you are looking for the ones that can still be open. So if you are into preferences, lots and lots of other things, which we'll talk some of them, there are lots and lots of ways of basically is providing preferences. HTM becomes just one way of providing preferences. It wasn't the real reason for inventing HTMs, but it turns out that's the way they wind up being used. Say it's like a roundabout way. Yes, you had a question.
Sorry.
No, maybe what, yeah.
Yeah. So if you're doing abstraction, then how are we providing grammar for that? I mean, if you are
No, again, I think you are talking about, again, please understand that these schemas are given by the domain writer. So they provide the grammar.
okay.
So again, I was telling somebody else that for natural language, it's not even clear whether there is a grammar. In fact, one can argue that part of the reason second language acquisition is so damn hard is because we tend to try to learn grammar and then construct grammatical sentences. This only makes sense to people who know more than one language and learn the second language when they're older. Okay, and it turns out that is a bad way of learning language. The best way to learn language is, basically jump into the deep end and try to survive. Like while people are laughing at you when you are making grammatically wrong sentences, you still survive in Japan or in China or in UK or in Poland, and then you will essentially just let the brain do its thing, and then it figures out what is grammatically correct. Again, actually there is no simple grammatical, in fact there's this whole raging question in language as to whether grammar rules are categorical or they just references. Right, because you do know that for many grammar rules there are exceptions, and those exceptions have exceptions, and so on and so forth. So in fact, language, it turns out, actually one can argue that most of natural language processing literature was essentially, originally, trying to come up with different types of grammars for language, let's say English or something, different types of grammars, and then use that to kind of as the first step in trying to do language processing. And that went out the window, right? Because you essentially say, screw it, because we can never do this, and instead you just give all of it to your LLM, and then it just basically learns the implicit grammar. Do you see what I'm saying? In the case of language, talking about grammar, even though it's easier to give the language processing thing, it turns out that basically kind of learning language by learning grammar upfront may or may not be the correct way to do it. But you do know that formal languages, like computer languages, have grammar. It's not like the Python interpreter says, yeah, you could have said it in a different way, but I'll give it to you this time. There is no such thing. It's a categorical grammar. If it is syntactic error, it will just say, oh no, it's okay, syntactic error, I'll still make a decision on your behalf and compile. There is no such thing. So if you think of what is happening in the Python interpreter, etc., and in fact, if you think of IDE, interactive development environments, again, every damn analogy I give is late already because nobody writes programs anymore. You just prompt Claude and then it gives something. Right? But imagine like a month and a half back when you were still writing programs, right? Right? When you're writing programs, then you start typing, and then it will basically do the same thing that your Google Doc is doing these days. In fact, it's not that Google Doc was late entry because we didn't know how to use the grammar for language before. But for formal languages, Backus and our form grammars, BNF grammars exist. If you take a programming language course, there is a BNF grammar for everything. And that's the only thing that's allowed. Right? And so you basically wind up writing programs that are syntactically correct with respect to the grammar. And then you can basically say that if it's not syntactically correct, there is no question about is it semantically correct. It's just not allowed in that case. Right? Okay. Did I get this because of some other question? Did I answer your question? What? Okay. Somebody else had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, does this soft preferences, does it effectively allow optimizing the language?
Yes, it is. It is. But again, one of the other things you have to understand is optimization is search. And one of the things is that it's not at all clear that optimality search is going on in anything related to LLM reasoning models, for example. You know, we are happy that they at least got a plan. not that it got the correct. And in fact, one of the weirdo things is, as I said, what helps is that if they get the plan correct, they probably also get it reasonably kind of in the way people like it. Because that's the data they've been trained on. You see what I'm saying? Just because of the memory effect, they might wind up having that. Okay.
Is there some sense in which optimizing with respect to preferences or something is easier than before?
Again, what I'm saying is you could think of, in fact, as I said, there are works. There is a paper, there is a work by Sheila McElraith, Jorge Bayer, and other people who basically, and again, you know, when I say this, you can ask me, I'll send papers, who actually write HTMs as preferences, preference constraints. And we have done some work saying HTM as preferences too. And then you start out doing optimization. Either you do optimization directly as a sub constraint, or you do it as a parsing, which will be a categorical yes or no. Okay. Yeah, okay, so I would not, yeah, so, okay, I'll get back off this. And so that's all about HTN, and then I'm going to go and actually start from the beginning and see how much I can go faster. These are all the simpler abstractions. Not too many slides, so it's not that bad. Okay, so, and I can almost read this along with you, right, essentially, because I said most of this anyway. So abstraction hierarchy is important, making plan tractable when you have very long range planning. That's normally still the main reason why people think abstraction is important. It's like you are making 30 million step plan, making step 1, step 2, step 3, etc. is just essentially impossible, right? And so you have to use some kind of an abstraction. Okay, so that's what, given that your life is strictly speaking not episodic, you are making one long 3 gazillion action plan. I know where that 3 came, but apparently it's 3 gazillion action plan for the life. Clearly it's impossible. In fact, that's what, by the way, John Lennon said, that life is what happens when you're busy making plans. That's actually true, because planning is so damn hard that you're just basically making the plan and the life just continues happening. Anyway, but there are many ideas across planning, and connected to one of the other things that, you know, I can only make so much sense to you unless you have background in RL and MVPs, but I can make the connections that, you know, some of the ideas can be essentially all of the things that I discussed for PDL planning have analogs for MVP-based policies, essentially. And that's been called hierarchical reinforcement learning. Okay, and basically, you can almost ask, how are they pushing this under the rug? Every problem that we discussed, they exist there. Essentially, there's like no question. Okay. Then many of them sound great upfront, but on closer examination tend to suffer from all kinds of problems. So if I told you that hierarchical task network planning is a top level task, and then you can then reduce it to different partial plans, it looks like a great idea. What can go wrong? But most of what I did today is basically saying all sorts of things can go wrong. And in fact, it's not as easy as it sounds. Within strips planning, focus was on using abstractions right during the planning, which is that second part. And then, of course, acquiring abstractions, which sometimes they did. You know, most of the time they assume the abstractions are given by the humans, the domain writers. Okay. So desirable properties, of course, soundness. If you have an abstract plan, can it be made concrete? That's the downward refinement property. Completeness, is the abstraction complete or optimal? That is, can you find all the plans you could find before without the abstraction? And the point is, this is, I don't even know why, actually I think I showed a picture of a megaword dog when I was doing this last time, but don't ignore the reference to megaword dog. The point is, actually I'll argue that completeness is a dump, and completeness with respect to would the plan that you find with the abstraction as optimal as the plan that the normal planner would have found without abstractions. And my argument is that's a bad comparison. Because your whole abstraction is that there will be standard ways of traveling. Do you see what I'm saying? And if stowaway is a way of traveling too, right? And that's the cheapest plan. So in terms of the cost, stowaway plans cannot, I mean, no standard plan can compete with, stowaway plans in terms of cost. So I would argue that any abstraction would not be optimal with respect to stowaway plans. And why stowaway? Hitchhiking is cheap too, which is why all the students seem to try it. Right? You might get killed once in a while, but who cares? I mean, it's right. I mean, it's like you're young. So I don't understand. That's one of the other things, right? I mean, the young basically have the least respect for living, and the old people want to keep the fewer years left, which is why we send young people to war, and we sit in the background and do stuff. But anyway, so the point being that completeness is a strange question to ask, because any moment you have abstraction, you are giving up some kinds of plans. I can always make the optimality constraint be such that the ones that you gave up are actually more optimal. If you wanted optimality with respect to the full space, just go with that. There are very, very few places where completeness will actually be guaranteed, and those would be the places where the extra detail was probably unnecessary. In no situation will it ever be usable. Right? And otherwise, then basically abstraction means you are cutting down by looking at some kind of things. Stability is, are abstractions problem agent specific? Are they general properties across problems and agents? Once again, this winds up being an important issue. It depends actually, abstractions do depend on the problem distribution. Right? If the problems are standard, most standard problems tend to be having like airplane, flying and going by train thing, then that's a good abstraction. If most of the problems that you're threatening basically, so it's a post-apocalypse, the current HTN abstractions are useless, right? Because there's no planes. So obviously it's useful in the sense planning is done very fast and say no plan, no plan, no plan, and then you get to be happy. But then basically you have to come up with a different level of abstractions, different type of abstractions. Okay? So that's what I'm thinking. Again, notice that I could have said this in the very beginning of the class, and what is the chance that you would have understood with the level of understanding you might be having now, because we spent this entire class talking about all the problems. So when I say this now, it makes sense. So this is why people, I just basically say that you should write the entire paper and then write the introduction. Right? And then similarly, you should tell the introduction like more or less afterwards. Anyway, yeah, these are all the different things. So there are different types of abstractions, and I listed them basically. So there is, I'll say it at top level, and then we'll see some things. So there's a kind of a idea called detail abstraction, which is essentially work on the more important things first. Okay, and so actually, abstrips is the thing that came after strips, and what it basically said is some preconditions of the actions are given level of importance, 1, 2, 3, let's say. And the idea would be to make sure that all one level preconditions of all actions are established. Then you'll have a skeletal plan. Then you work on making it such that its 2-level precondition will also be established. Then you work on making it sure that its 3-level precondition will also be established. This looks like a great idea. But I don't know how many of you realize that strips used to actually use plans that are contiguity constraints, right? Action, next action, nothing comes with 3. If you have a 3-action plan that basically next to each other, they're cemented, and they only are supporting the top level preconditions, like first level preconditions, then you now are trying to extend this plan to make the second level preconditions hold. Do you realize that you can't do it with the contiguity constraint? You have to assume that the plan actually has precedence constraints, and so you put in other actions to deal with these other conditions. Which is one of the reasons why plan space planning wins in the end. It's the most general kind of planning. Right? Because you have a partial plan with some number of actions, and then you basically work on these conditions, and then basically you put extra actions. So from partial order planning, so it turns out that abstrips essentially works for strips. And it basically does this hybrid approach where you first run strips only with the 1-level preconditions, and it comes up with a plan. Then you call the strips planner recursively between every 2 actions. You see what I'm saying? Every 2 actions to consider the lower level preconditions. So in doing so, you are essentially, kind of scoot a bit so that I can put one more action in between you two, which basically means you never really meant those actions to be contiguous to begin with. So it looks like AppStrips is actually a different algorithm than strips. If you're doing plan space planning, I would argue, if you're doing plan space planning, and I told you that all the preconditions of actions, all actions have numbers, and 1 is the most important, 2 is the second most, and 3 is the third most. How would you use it in plan space planning? Yeah.
You just go like you would try to achieve the goals of the most important one first, and then copy the result.
So remember, in plan space planning, you have to pick flaws. The flaws are open conditions and unsafe links. Previously, you would pick any open condition. Right now, you will pick all the 1-level open conditions first. Then you will pick all the 2-level open conditions. Then you will pick all the 3-level open conditions. That's it. So it turns out that it's just the order in which you are picking the things. It's the same damn algorithm. Nothing needs to change for plan space planning to introduce quote-unquote precondition abstraction. It's just the order in which flaws are picked for resolution. Whereas if you're doing the same thing on strips, you actually have to change the algorithm. Because strips normally gives contiguous action plans. And you now somehow have to make space between contiguous actions by saying, scoot a bit guys, I'm putting more stuff in between. For plan space planning, that's not a problem. So for the longest time, basically this was like a big deal, that AppStrips kind of a thing. And there are other papers which basically still talk about these kinds of precondition abstractions, even now in different different guises. But there are two issues. One, of course, is that for plan space planning, it just becomes a goal ordering condition. Okay. The other thing that you may or may not have thought about is the temporal abstraction. Temporal abstraction basically is to do things. Basically, if you have 300-step plan, then you want to make big steps. So you make it's like instead of making 300 steps, like this, you make one big step and then another big step, etc. Each big step is a sequence of small steps. Those are called macros, macro operators. One of the simplest ideas for abstraction in strips was macro operators. The idea was, whenever you solve a problem, you now have a plan. So previously an action had preconditions and effects. Now somebody gives you I and G for a new problem, and then you actually solve it. You have action 1, action 2, action 3, and it gives G. Now I can say this action 1, action 2, action 3 is a compound action. It's called a macro operator. And you know what its preconditions are, what its effects are. So you throw this into your action library. You see what I'm saying? So if you do this in the action library, then what happens is in the search, in essence, whenever you pick a macro operator, you are skipping levels. So if you're thinking each action one level in the search tree, macro operators do quote unquote, it's the opposite of the residual connections. You're just skipping levels as big as macro. Beautiful idea. So what if you just skip right away to the goal? You're done. Right? So the problem with macro operators, and by the way, this is one of the first ideas for macro operators that people came up with. And the problem with the macro operators is that the way you become happy in life is, so macro operators, so they, let's say normal search has B power D as the total search. B is the branching factor, D is the depth. And actually no, let's write it like this. Let's write it. Let's write it as small b or big D, for reasons that will become clear. Normal search is small b for big D. You have to go very deep, but if you have a small branching factor, which is the actual action setting here. Right? With the macro operators, you're saying the big D becomes small d. Very good, right? D is much less than capital D. Effectively. But then B becomes capital B. Right? B becomes capital B because at every place, not only are you looking at the normal actions, but you are also looking at the macros. Right? So there is no reason to believe that capital B power small d is always less than small b power capital D. Do you see what I'm saying? In fact, if anything, I would say that you can shoot yourself multiple ways. You can increase the depth, or you can increase the branching factor. Either way, search space becomes hard down there. Do you see what I'm saying? By the way, this issue would, the reason you don't realize this is you think if I have the macro operator, I would know which macro operator to use exactly. But if you know which macro operator to use, then you would also have known which action to use. If you had a really rich uncle telling you which direction to go, that rich uncle already would have told you which action to use. Because the rich uncle doesn't exist, then you're doing these macros. That means now you actually have many more choices, and you still have the same old, not particularly smart uncle who's just saying, try one of these things. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in general, actually, macro operators is one of these great ideas that doesn't work in any systematic sense. There's no reason for it to work unless, as I said, somehow you oracularly figure out the right macro. And believe it or not, this part, this thing that you can write in big letters, and you can see that this is being rediscovered without admission in multiple planning reasoning papers, even in the context of LLM era. Because they will say, we have plans, we will store the plans, and they will reuse them. But storing the plans is like a macro. How do you make sure you, in a way, of course, you're saying, anyway, I'm not doing the search, so I'm just doing generate and test, so what does it matter? But in general, if you're doing systematic search, it becomes very clear that the branching factor increased, depth decreased, so that doesn't mean that it's always a win. So for this, then, there is an entire area of machine learning that was into selective forgetting. In fact, this has been given a name called the utility problem. The utility problem. Basically, you get more macros, or if you actually sort of memorize a whole bunch of previous solutions, etc., then the question is how to use them. Right? And whenever you have a decision point what to do, now I have many more choices. Unless there is any magically, unless it is one of those cases where you can magically pick the correct direction, basically there is no guarantee that if you increase the branching factor, that will allow you to make big steps. I mean, if you are increasing the branching factor by allowing yourself to make big steps, that directly translates into search improvements. So this has been called utility problem in learning. And these kinds of things are actually called speed up learning algorithms, right? As against inductive learning algorithms. Inductive learning algorithms basically means I found a new action that didn't even exist before, in the case of planning. Whereas speed up learning is, I know how to solve this problem, but this is too damn slow, so I'm going to kind of remember some of the plans that I've solved before. You see what I'm saying? And the issue, of course, is that utility problem is there's no obvious solution. It's an open problem in general. If you sometimes think that I use the macro operator is improved, but then there's always a possibility that macro operators actually worsen the speed. Right? You understand this? Okay. Now, why is this an issue? Macro operators, nobody cares because you never even heard about it. How many of you have heard of options? Why? Because Rich Sutton talks about it. Right? Law talks about it, who cares? Rich Sutton law, that's good stuff. Options are macro operators for MDPs. That's it. I said it. Options are macro operators for MDPs. And they have the same exact problem that I told you here. There would now be, in an MDP, again, I'm assuming that you know something about MDPs. At some point of time, I'll do remedial education, but if you don't, I told you where I thought MDPs and other. but for those of you who know something about it. So in the case of MDP, right, the action space, like at every state, the agent has to decide which action to do, right? Which action to do, and each of those actions, let's say in the normal case, it will be like, you know, a number of actions, like a total cardinality A of the actions. With the options, it is increasing. Right? So you go back and listen to the oak architecture talk that Rich Sutton just gave in URIPS this year. And I live tweeted it, you know, yelling at him in the background. Basically saying, you know, let's do it all from the bottom, let's learn options. And I say, Rich, who's going to tell you which are the right options to keep? You see what I'm saying? How do you know which options to keep? Because options are basically macro operators. If anything, they are more complicated. Because in the case of, so a macro operator is a sequence of actions, and then the sequence is put in a black box. You say these are the preconditions that have to flow into the black box. These are the effects that will come out of the black box. An option is a black box MDP, which has some number of initial entry states, some number of exit states. And once you go into the initial state, there is an internal policy. Just like the macro operator, once you enter the macro operator, you do the first action, then the next action, then the next action, then the next action, until you come out. An option, you go into the option, it tells you, okay, in this place, you are supposed to use this policy. Options comes with, option is an MDP with a policy, a small MDP with a policy. A macro operator is an option for sequential plans. You understand what I'm saying? And so whatever I said about macro operators is true also for options. And yet people somehow think that magic will happen with options. Well, it can happen if somehow you kept the right options and threw away everything else. Exactly how are you going to do it? It's not obvious. If you could do that, you could do it here too. Do you understand what I'm saying? Again, this is the kind of thing where things are connected, and it's very easy to be seduced by the notion of abstraction. Like, notion of abstraction is like notion of lottery ticket. How can you not be interested in lottery ticket? You buy this, you only $1 and you can become millionaire. Right? I mean, how can it be a bad idea? Well, that's because most of the time, if you take it over a long enough time, you're spending more money because the house always wins. So you must be spending, most of you suckers are spending more money than you will ever get in expectation. That's the only reason why lotteries make sense. And as somebody said, lotteries are a tax on stupid people. And actually, there's a better way of looking at it, basically. I'll talk about it in a different time. But in general, that's the thing. So you think lottery is like a big step. I'm here, I can make $1 today, $2 more tomorrow, etc. Instead, a huge, big macro step. So I can buy different lotteries. Lottery jackpot of Ohio, jackpot of Oregon, jackpot of ASU, jackpot of something else, right? And then I'm paying money for all of these, and the question, of course, is there any guarantee that, yes, if it works out, yes, but in expectation, is it likely to work? Same with options. If you magically pick the right option, you're good. But most of us don't have magic. So then how is it going to work? At any rate, I would want you to ask yourself, if you ever read a paper on options, ask yourself, how are they going to pick among the options? And why isn't it actually? So one way these things don't matter, for example, here, by the way, I should tell you this. This argument would matter for systematic search. But if you're doing local search, things are better. If you're doing hill climbing, right, then it's not d power d, it is just that at every point you have more actions, and maybe you will find which is a better gradient step and you do that. It turns out that it's not that complexity goes away because you do local search. It is that you can at least convince yourself that things are okay for a longer time. Right? That's part of the reason why people tend to believe that options and macro operators might work, because if you're doing local search, this d power d argument doesn't make sense. Because the whole point of local search is you can be the luckiest person and you just pick the right because the gradient is your friend. The gradient tells you what to pick. And then that gradient is just a different name for which uncle, or the smart uncle who is just trying to help you which action to take. Okay, so that's about the strips, macros, and macros are connected options. I'll take 10 more minutes before we go off, so that because I don't want to come back to this anymore. So then we did the entire hierarchical task decomposition. I talked to you about the detailed abstraction. You can read this. This is about the preconditions and abstracts. And then I told you that precondition abstracts just becomes a open condition flaw picking strategy in plan space planning. So it's not even a different planner. And it, and then generally detailed postponement will always work. That's a kind of an abstraction. And in fact, that is the disjunctive ordering, or like an A1, A2, and like make an action which is either A1 or A2. And then use that in the search. That would be postponing detail. That's another way of abstraction. By the way, this is actually worthwhile telling you, right? To give you a sense. So imagine you have a planner, blocks world plan, right? And in blocks world, you know that essentially you have a hand and blocks. Suppose I were to give you infinite number of hands.
Infinite number of
hands. Not instead of infinite, let's say 15 hands. Instead of normal blocks code has one hand and whatever number of blocks in the initial state that need to go through it. Suppose I were to give you 10 hands. Right? What would you think? The planning should be faster or slower?
Same.
Because at the end of the day, you're killing your enthusiasm. Let's ask two different questions. Do you think the plan can be shorter or longer? Shorter, because you have multiple actions, multiple hands. You can do parallel plan, parallel blocks and parallel. Plan can be shorter. Right? Would planning be faster? You would think it would be. But it turns out, basically, it's much worse. This was a 2000 paper by one of my students, Nicola. What he did was he took the graph plan algorithm, the one we talked about, and then it basically made it, he made it solve a block sort problem and a flexible block sort problem where there are more hands. More hands makes the problem, quote unquote, planning is easier to some extent. But systematic searchers will think that if there is a failure with one hand, maybe that will go away magically with a different hand. Because that's how search works. So in fact, it turns out that if you increase the number of hands, number of basically the kind of robot hands, the search complexity increases exponentially, which is very counterintuitive. But it's similar to the B power D problem. Because now there is a branching factor is higher, there are more hands, and you have to figure out which hand to pick with what. And if you fail, you think maybe there's a magical hand I should pick it up with. You might say commonsensically all of that makes no sense. But if you have the common sense, what you would then do is essentially split it into two parts. One is assume there's an abstract hand for each pickup action. So you will give a plan that is correct modulo the action hand assignment. Then you do a separate scheduling stage where you actually decide, given the plan that is there, which abstract hand becomes which concrete hand. It's just a two-level abstract planning. That actually is much better. Do you see what I'm saying? So just because your abstraction using it has to be thought of carefully, because systematic searchers can actually get lost because they have now more hands. The choice can be, in fact this is true for humans too, because there is this notion of paradox of choice. If you have too much choice, you don't know what to do. But normally, how can too much choice be a bad thing? It is a bad thing because we apparently have bad brains. Right? And systematic searchers also get into that sort of problem. It's worthwhile keeping that. So temporal abstractions, the macro operators I mentioned, the macro operators versus options, this is the thing that I was telling you about. Essentially, options are for, for basically the MDPs, and then both of them, they increase the branching factor. And it's not hard to decide to keep macro operators or options. The bigger thing is to decide which ones are worth keeping, which ones are not worth keeping. That is again a learning problem, a separate learning problem. So, like basically, which of the macro operators based off of the same actions are worth keeping and which are not worth keeping. And whenever you're doing it, you have to ask yourself, what happens to all these completeness, soundness constraints that we were talking about when you have these macro operators? One of the things that happens with the macro operators sometimes is you might basically, believe it or not, you can get an inoptimal plan with macro operators. Right? Because it turns out that you can get P by just doing 2 normal actions or do this 10 action block, which also gives P. To you, it looks like just a step. But the guy who pays for the actions realizes that the 10 action thing is actually 10 costly. So if you're not careful, if you don't separate the action cost, you can actually get inoptimal plans. And it's the same thing for options. Right? By the way, I think I can stop at this point because I've gone back enough in time that the next would be my elementary school essays. So this is my master's thesis in 1984. And this is me doing options for free space. Okay, so imagine the following thing. So you have S here, you have let's say G there, or G in some free space there. And you're supposed to find a path. And you can find a path through the grid. But you can do abstraction over the grid, and there are many, many ways of doing abstractions over grids. One is what's called a quad-tree abstraction. Quad-tree abstraction, I mean, is basically like it divides the space, free space, into 4 quadrants. If it's all white, then it says it's one single white node. If it's all black, it says one single black node. If not, it says gray node. And the gray node will then again be subdivided. You can see where I'm going with this, right? Right? And so basically, so I have, this is the thing, and so there are big, big white nodes, and there are also parts which are basically, like more finely split quad-tree thing. And then what happens in the search is you do A star search in terms of the gray nodes, and basically white and gray nodes. And if it's a gray node, the gray node basically, if it becomes a part of the plan, then you know how to enter and you have to figure out how to get out of it. That's basically options. Do you see what I'm saying? And so this is, at that time for some strange reason, I called it multi-resolution path planning, which it is in some sense. I would not say that quad-trees are the greatest way to do abstraction. It's actually a very strict thing. If you change if you kind of shift a picture slightly, such that it gets misaligned with the actual axis, then suddenly it will start having many more gray nodes than before, for example. But it sort of tells you the same idea, except being done in the much simpler scenario. That's me actually. Anyway, so macro observation, yeah. So this is the PhD stuff. That's more of the DU stuff, and I don't want to talk about replay. And then I got to HTMs, which, if you have seen reverse Seinfeld episode, I don't need to do that part because you've already done it in reverse. So thank you.